Good afternoon, everyone. And I'd really very much like to thank you, Veronica, and the forum for putting this session together. And first and foremost, I think it's just very exciting to be here to be able to honor Dr. Fauci, who's been an inspiration to many of us on many levels. I first became familiar with his work while I was doing my training in Boston when he was working with Sheldon Wolf and Charles Dinarello, and actually pre-AIDS helped elucidate some of our current understanding of immunopathogenesis. And it's like really an example of the right person at the right time, because in his role at the NIH, he had a fundamental understanding of where the lesion was and was able to work with epidemiologists and molecular virologists to really pull things together very quickly. And as Dr. Hirsch said, it's not only this capacity as a very careful, analytical, basic scientist and an experienced research administrator, but somebody who actually listens and filters information in a way that can synthesize and say, you know, we have to deal with the community. We can't do this by ourselves. There's a lot of concern out there. And to be able to have that equanimity and to keep the enterprise moving forward, particularly as we recall a less supportive environment in some of the earliest days, I think we're very fortunate, and it's why I think this is so appropriate. We have an incredibly talented and diverse panel today, and just want to introduce some of our panelists before we get going. To my right, Dr. Sharon Hillier. She is a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive sciences, as well as molecular genetics and biochemistry at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. She's also the principal investigator of the Microbicides Trials Network. Dr. Hillier has made some fundamental observations in terms of molecular microbiology even prior to her involvement in HIV prevention research, and really has given us a fundamental understanding of vaginal ecology, vaginal microflora. In 2010, she was named to a 2-year term as chair of the NIH Office of AIDS Research Advisory Council, which advises the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services. She also has played a seminal role, no pun intended, in many scientific initiatives focusing on reproductive health and HIV. Sitting next to her is Dr. James Kern. Dr. Kern is a professor of epidemiology and dean at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University. He is the principal investigator and co-director of the Emory Center for AIDS Research. Dr. Kern became familiar to many of us in his initial 3-month stint from the Centers for Disease Control to conduct the initial outbreak investigation of what came to be known as the AIDS pandemic. He was responsible for the initial reports, including the one that Dr. Hirsch cited in Morbidity and Mortality Weekly reports. From the outset of the epidemic, he was involved in every aspect, tracking the epidemiology and determining the most effective ways to engage the community and to try, again, to put science in a place where there was a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. Sitting next to Dr. Kern is Lynda Dee. Lynda is president of AIDS Action Baltimore, an attorney who began her career involvement in AIDS serving the gay community in the early 80s. She's well known for her integrity and community advocacy. She's received awards from multiple organizations, including the Human Rights Campaign Fund for her advocacy work. She has been a member of the NIH's Office of AIDS Research Clinical Trials Review Panel, of the NIH ACDG Executive Committee and Community Constituency Group. She was one of the first co-chairs of the Drug Development Committee of the AIDS Treatment Activist Coalition, and she continues to exert pressure on government and industry to study the real-life strategies for the use of new anti-HIV drugs as well as their long-term side effects. She is familiar to many people in this part of Washington, D.C. on the Hill, and has now increasingly devoted her attention to advocacy around hepatitis C virus. Sitting next to Lynda is Dr. Roger Pomerantz, who is Senior Vice President of Merck Research Laboratories and Global Health Franchise Head for Infectious Diseases at Merck & Company. In this role, he oversees Merck's global scientific direction and strategy across drug discovery and development for infectious diseases. Prior to this, he was president of Tibotec Therapeutics, and under his leadership, the company initiated the launch of 8 new drugs to treat HIV, hepatitis C, and multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. Prior to that, he served as the chief of infectious disease and professor at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. He received training from Johns Hopkins and also spent a little time in Boston too, way back when. And sitting next to Dr. Pomerantz, we're very fortunate to have Jesse Milan. Cornelius Baker, who is listed on the program, unfortunately was detained, but we're very fortunate to have Jesse Milan, who's Vice President and Director of Community Health Systems for Altram Institute. Jesse is a lawyer by training. He has served in capacity as the AIDS Director for the City of Philadelphia and in several other senior public health positions around HIV/AIDS. He also has spent a lot of his time commuting to Atlanta. He has been chair of the CDC HRSA Advisory Committee and was the chair of the external peer review program that took several years and seemed to go on forever of the CDC's HIV/AIDS programming. He also is the chair emeritus of the Black AIDS Institute. So I'd like to start off our panel discussion today by asking each of you, where were you when the epidemic first happened, when you first became aware of AIDS, and how did your initial insights lead to the development of your careers involved in dealing with this epidemic? Sharon.
I was a young postdoc, just looking for my first position as a postdoctoral fellow, and in that, for that reason, was traveling around the United States looking at different fellowship opportunities. And as I did that, I visited a lot of Texas, Houston, New York City, Seattle, Los Angeles. And in each of those places, this was in 1982, every place I went, everyone was talking about this new epidemic. And I learned at the same time, one of my childhood friends growing up north of Seattle in the Dairy region was ill. His name was Marvin, and it turned out he had AIDS. And the mystery disease that was on everyone's lips as we moved from place to place was the thing that was killing my childhood friend. And I decided right then it was an important thing we needed to work on.
Jim.
In 1981, I was chief of the research branch of the STD division, and my last big decision was to fund the hepatitis B vaccine trial in gay men in the United States. Merck had Merck's vaccine, and then we learned of these cases of pneumocystis pneumonia that were occurring in gay men and contacted many people in our community. Several of us were detailed during a time of rather budget austerity to work on the problem now 30.5 years ago. And I'd just like to say one thing, and that is that I'm really happy to be here to honor both Surgeon General Koop and Tony Fauci. I think they, more than almost anyone else, represent the difference that people make. Surgeon General Koop was the Surgeon General at the right place at the right time in the AIDS epidemic, perhaps getting advice from his personal physician. And Tony Fauci has been there from the very beginning and continues to be there to make sure that science is contributing all it can and as a public spokesman. So I think that we are very happy to be here.
Where was I? Well, I had just graduated from law school, and I was installed in the bar in Maryland in 1981. And like you described, with my advocacy work and my legal work, I wore two hats in those days, and I was I liked to club and dance, and I was a bit of a party girl, and I spent a lot of time in clubs in Baltimore and Washington and Philadelphia and New York. I met my husband in New York in 1981 and moved there in 1982. And lo and behold, you know, different people that were, he used to stand over there, where is he? Gone, you know. So many of our friends, the people we knew, sick, dead in a weekend, you know, suffering from all these awful diseases. So we moved back to Baltimore in 1985, and my husband was diagnosed with AIDS in 1986. And he was hospitalized like 9 times. So I watched so many of my friends over those 9 hospitalizations suffer from so many horrible opportunistic infections started AIDS Action Baltimore, realized very quickly that research was the answer and going to be the answer, naively thought that we're in America. If we can send a man to the moon, if we put enough money into this, we can cure this. Here we are, 30 years later. Started at Hopkins, persuaded, shall we say, Dr. Bartlett to initiate a community advisory board at Hopkins, and realized that Baltimore was not where it was at, it was Bethesda. So started working at the NIH with the ACTG, where Tony mandated, actually ordered the docs to work with us. You've got to deal with them, and period. Nobody liked it. For better or worse, we're here, and I think we can thank Tony for that. What else? I think a very interesting thing is that, I'm a cancer survivor, and I worked with the ECOG system for a while through the NCI, and I watched those brave women with breast cancer use the same tactics and methods that the AIDS activists were using. So I saw that firsthand. And I've also seen firsthand in HCV. I was diagnosed with HCV a few years ago. And I've worked with the Forum extensively over the years. It's been wonderful. They really have moved the field ahead, especially in trial design. It's been particularly interesting to me. And I am now on an HCV clinical trial that is actually using one of the trial designs that the community, in collaboration with our colleagues at the FDA, promoted at one of the Forum meetings. So I've come full circle, and I've actually benefited from the work that I've been doing all these years. So it's kind of ironic, I guess, huh? Great. Glad to be here to honor the Forum and Dr. Fauci, who's meant so much to all of us.
Right, Roger.
You know, it's sort of funny, when I heard about this question, it's one of those things, if you're in AIDS research, where it's like, where were you on September 11th? Where were you when, if you're old enough, almost like me, where were you when Kennedy was killed? You actually remember these things. So this is my story. So I was a fourth-year medical student in 1981 at Hopkins when a new head of ID just started. His name was John Bartlett, and he was doing anaerobic research. I was going to be a cardiologist and was very sure of that, took an elective in ID in my senior year, had John Bartlett, I think the first or second time you were on the service, and we saw, and I can still see him, a young white male, gay, who was dying of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. And that's my aha moment, Marty. We didn't know what to do. We had all these hypotheses. He went on to die. And all the guys who I thought were clinical heroes were, what is this? And I got hooked. And I went to the Mass General, met people like Marty Hirsch, David Ho, Chip Schooley, did my internship and residency, was asked to stay in infectious disease, did my clinical ID there, and then decided that it was time to try to make an impact on the epidemic. Even though I was a clinician at heart, I was a doctor who got interested in research, not a researcher who got interested in medicine. And I went into Marty's lab. He put up with a lot of bad experiments that first 6 months, and got to know the team. Then was asked to come back to be the chief medical resident at MGH, did that, saw patients with this disease, was further convinced that it was going to be a research play for a while as opposed to a clinical play to change this. And much to the chagrin of my new wife and young baby, did another postdoc at MIT with a guy named David Baltimore, where we studied HIV latency, and I got to know a lab next door by another guy named Peter Kim, who is now my boss as the head of R&D at Merck. Went into medicine and tried to have some impact on this, both clinically, working at the FDA on the advisory committee with an old friend from way back who taught me a lot, and then looked for new challenges, and with Tibetech and Merck, tried to continue to work with great people and have an impact. And I think, as Marty pointed out, it's always bad to put up a sign that says mission accomplished, right? That never works. but we've had a mission that has had a lot of accomplishments. We still have a while to go. I think investigators in academia, the NIH, people like Tony Fauci, people at Merck and other companies are going to be part of the solution, as they have been for the partial solution in the last 30 years. And I'm just really delighted to be here.
Thanks. Jesse.
Well, when I received the invitation to attend this symposium, I couldn't say no because some of my personal heroes were going to be honored and here. John Bartlett, who's been my own doctor, and Jim Kern and Tony Fauci. 30 years ago, I was emancipated because I graduated from law school, but I say I was emancipated because I was a newly open gay man who had just graduated from law school. And some of the images that we saw in Dr. Hirsch's presentation take me back because Lynda may not remember because we graduated in the same year, but the bar exam is given on the same day all across the country, and it just so happened to be the day of Princess Diana's wedding. And so I feel this 30-year trajectory of everything old is new again in some respects. And as a newly open gay man who was living in my own apartment, that MMWR that we saw that picture of went right over my head. But the articles about grids hit me in the like a knife in my heart, because it meant gay men were dying of something bizarre, and I was now one of them. And frankly, I thought, it must be something in the water in San Francisco. Surely the health department will figure it out. The next year, I fell in love with someone and became infected myself. And I've been living with HIV now for 29 years. And so this trajectory is both personal and professional. And that trajectory has included so many of the changes that some of you in this room are responsible for, as well as the policies that have been enacted in these very chambers. So I'm very pleased to be here.
Thank you. So I was probably the only gay man in Boston, I think, who had a subscription to MMWR, because when you're a medical student, it used to be in the 70s that MMWR was free. So it was like medical student law would be like, what journals could you get for free? So it was Mayo Clinic Proceedings, MMWR. And I was cutting up plasmids in the basement of the Brigham and Women's Hospital for my mentor, I think, is now more famous, being Conan O'Brien's father. But I also wanted to do community service, so I was working at Fenway Health and going back and forth across town. And to me, one of the most amazing things I think that this epidemic has done is this forced crosstalk between scrappy community agencies and the research community, and really has transformed the way in which we do research in a number of ways. So I'd like to ask the panelists to think about, from your own disciplines and perspective, what are some of the lessons that we've learned over the last 30 years, things that we had to do to galvanize to deal with the AIDS epidemic that we built on from other knowledge, other disciplines that now inform other ways that research is conducted?
Well, when I think about the legacy of what AIDS research and NIH and people like Dr. Fauci have brought that have really had a sustained impact are, I think, really four main areas. I think, first of all, we learned that we had to have research capacity in the right places. It had to be in the right communities, the right folks, not just for treatment, but to reach out to where the people were. Secondly, to engage with those communities. And I think really what has changed forever is the notion that research happens in a silo. We've found in my research network that I lead, the Microbicide Trials Network, that community members are part of our protocol development processes from the earliest steps. And it's not just been the right thing to do, it's actually led to better science, because we really know much better what are the issues for community members. So research capacity in the right communities, as well as engaging with communities. Third thing, I think the thing that has really been key is that we've learned to ask to conduct the right studies, the key studies that needed to be done. Not just what's interesting science, not what's going to get you maybe a cell paper or a science paper, but what's going to make a difference, what's going to really impact care. And finally, I think partnership. Nobody can do this alone, and we've seen the NIH partner with Centers for Disease Control, with USAID, with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others. And I think it has absolutely changed the way we have thought about moving forward with these very large, complicated, intricate studies that have to be done in partnership with stakeholders, with communities, with caregivers, and really have changed the face of the way we've done a lot of research in other areas as well.
Jim.
I like this topic because it's very much central to the successes and the story of AIDS. I worked in STDs for 10 years before AIDS came along, and in general, people say, how come we don't treat AIDS like other STDs? And the answer it's because we don't want to ignore it, because of course we always ignored all the other STDs. The other thing is that the STD world at the time was very much of a medical model, doctor knows best, and the patients ought to get treated world. Hepatitis changed that, and the gay community was actively engaged in a lot of hepatitis epidemiology and hepatitis B vaccine trials before AIDS. And I think we're very fortunate that the gay community, not just Jesse, but the entire gay community came out of the closet the decade following Stonewall and preceding AIDS, because it led to a new way of looking at illness and a new way of looking at partnership, often difficult, and you know, sometimes Tony might have got locked in his office or chained to the fence or whatever. But the thing is, there was a lot of mutual learning around that. I can remember lots of times being forced to learn things myself. And the only thing I'd mention now is that we were talking before about the importance of linking prevention and care. And there was a seminal moment when Larry Kramer, who is still at it, was always after all of us. And he was, for a period of time before AZT and before, particularly before HART, very interested in the CDC. But after antiretrovirals became available, I was on a talk show with him, and the two of us were sitting there, and I was expecting him to beat me up. And he basically said, "You've become irrelevant." That was it. I mean, he didn't harm me, didn't try to do anything. But what he was telling me, that he, at least, and his constituents were so interested in saving their own lives and so interested in therapy and care that what I did, which was prevention, had to take a back seat. And it took me maybe a year or two to think about that, to realize that basically we were going to get nowhere with any kind of community-based efforts for prevention unless we dealt with what was most needed, that is saving the lives of the people. And I think that led to, continue to lead to things like PEPFAR, in which most of the global health community can't understand a treatment-oriented approach to what is a chronic disease, which seems like will take the resources that will never become available. But they don't understand that you can't get people tested, you can't get people interested in the problem, you can't get people to bring themselves out of the closet as a society without paying attention to what's killing them. And so I guess I reluctantly thank Larry for that.
Thanks. Lynda.
Reluctantly. We all say that about Larry in some regard. Well, you know, let me take it from a different angle. You know, I know what it feels like to be desperate, to have somebody you love be dying in front of your eyes, somebody that's 32 years old, 33 years old. And I remember trying things like AL721 and DNCB, and just out of pure desperation. And so what I learned initially was that you really need evidence-based research and methods in order to deal with this. And I think many of us learned that. I think most of the activist community are liberal arts majors. So, you know, and And I went to Catholic school, so all I ever learned about science was where the rain came from. I'm glad that didn't happen to you, Tony. Yeah, right. Ah, you're right. Mine were not Jesuits, that's it. My teachers. But, you know, I mean, we were desperate with things like compound Q, and my poor husband drinking that AL 721 and trying to burn off lesions with DNCB. I mean, what were we thinking? We were desperate. So I learned the science of it. I learned about treatment and care from Hopkins, Osler 5. I mean, you can't believe what those people were like, the treaters and the people that took such good care of people back in the day when people didn't know how you could get it or you know, I mean, they were just really heroes. And then from the ACTG, I really learned about clinical trials and clinical trial designs, and I'm a nuts and bolts girl, so I spent a lot of time at the NIH reviewing with Roger on a committee the AIDS portfolios of all the different institutes. So I really learned how that comes together and actually how it doesn't come together. You know, that's another place where Tony's been instrumental at working at collaborations, inter-institute collaborations that really are so important, especially today where we have to do more for less. I think it's really very interesting that the clinical recompetition deals with more than just HIV. I mean, it's being led by where the science is going and dealing with TB and hepatitis, other things, integration of things that is really a holistic way of looking at things that really is the way real life is. You know, I always say that not even the president can get the institutes to work together, but Tony's been able to do that. And I've always liked to not only do the national research stuff, but to work in Maryland and Baltimore in my community where I can really see the fruits of what's happening at the grassroots, or should I say the cement sidewalks. But it's been interesting how this, for instance, the Test and Treat initiative and the collaboration sort of progressive thinking has worked its way down to our, used to be AIDS administration in Maryland, and now it's the Infectious Disease Administration, which deals with a lot of different populations. Of course, I'm interested in HCV, but you know, they're often the same people, and why should they be siloed from here to there when you can do them both at the same time, accomplish twice as much? So it's been very interesting how this has all evolved from the CDC here, HRSA there, NIH here, and never the twain shall meet. So it's been very interesting to see how that has evolved into something that's real and actually working how people live and get sick and hopefully get better.
Thank you. Roger.
So I said in my last remarks, I really did grow up professionally with the AIDS epidemic. I'm going to be 55, so I was 25 when I saw those first cases with John and his team. And what I would say that I took out of it is dream big. As Marty pointed out, you started out with AZT, which, as a lot of you know, fell off the shelf, right? It was a cancer drug that by fortuitous screening was shown to be an RT inhibitor. Then, you know, everyone thought, well, this is how we're going to go about it, a little bit at a time. And rational drug design, which is something that is de rigueur now, was somewhere along in the future, and that was a big dream. And it happened relatively quickly, and it allowed you to put together the cocktail, the first combination heart, that changed really the planet in a lot of ways. That was a big dream at its time. And so now we see these different big dreams that it started out as being, you know, pie in the sky, and with technology and people working with the community and seeing what the pathogenesis of the disease is in the clinics, you were able to rationally target this stuff. And it no longer became sort of your father's medicine. So I think, you know, when we look at what are the big dreams now, well, one that was sort of bugaboo, no one would say the C word for a long, long time, right? Cure. And And you get to a point where you then have that ability to have Thomas Kuhn's paradigm shift. You have the ability to think about what the big dream is. And so we walked, then we did rational drug design, then we controlled if people, as Marty said, we can get the drugs to people, we can get it on a daily basis, we can put them to undetectable and they do well for at least some for the long term. But now you can start dreaming about what else you could do. And you took something that was really, you would think you were preposterous to talk about a cure. And now, you know, back in 2009, Daria Hazuda, who is my discovery head at Merck, and I and a couple of other great scientists wrote a paper in Science that some of you saw, asking about a combined approach. That now that we're able to do this with drugs, get people not only below 50, but many to 1 copy or below, it's now you can ask the question, can you cure them? And to Tony's credit, he took up that very quickly and saw that the time had changed, made it one of the major goals of NIAID. And the NIH, after working a little bit, got a RFA and put 3 co-laboratories out, as we called it, where the NIH, academia, and pharmaceutical companies or biotech will work together. It's probably a bad term, but sort of a combined Manhattan project on this. And we were proud at Merck that we are the pharmaceutical partner in 2 of those 3 collaboratories. We believe that these are that you can dream the big dreams, and they're only a big dream when you haven't solved them, right? And so whether it's a vaccine, which we stepped up to the plate and it wasn't positive, but we're very interested in thinking about, yes, this is a vaccineless world at this time, but it doesn't have to remain that. This is a disease that is rarely, if ever, cured, but we think you can dream that. And so, you know, when I go to our executive committee and we talk about what drugs we want to develop and what's good for the patients and what may make a fair profit for shareholders at the same time, we always have game changers, and we're true to it. So whether it's a vaccine or the cure laboratory that Daria runs, or whether it's trying to look at prevention with, as some of you know, with vaginal rings, with our NuvaRing technology, these are big dreams only now. So what I would say to the young people who are coming up, geez, I'm no longer a young person, is dream big. It's only a big dream before you can do it.
Great, thank you, Jesse.
Roger, I just turned 55 7 weeks ago, so
You're a little older.
I'm a little bit older, but it's quite amazing to think that someone living with HIV could actually say that they've lived to be this old. Absolutely. When in fact some of us on this panel buried men and even women who were 25 and 35 during the course of these past 30 years. So I don't mind giving the sage advice of lessons learned. Perhaps the 2 biggest lessons learned, I think, I mean, certainly speaking on behalf of those who aren't here to offer what lessons they would hope we would have learned, would be about the basic, long, enduring lessons of love one another and treat your neighbor as if it was you. That lesson is certainly a pervasive lesson for all of us, whether we're in public health or public advocacy. But I think we have certainly learned in HIV/AIDS that that picture of silence equal death reminds us that for HIV, it is critical to have those who are affected at the center of the conversation, whether it's public policy or about public health. And I think that other diseases have learned a great deal from that lesson of the importance, whether it's the Susan Comer and breast cancer, the giving voice to those who are affected and giving them that place is a central lesson from these last 30 years. And the second lesson I think that's important is that disease knows no color, no boundaries, no gender, no sex, no sexual orientation. And just a few weeks ago, we had the launch of the National Viral Hepatitis Plan for the United States. And the cultures of the Asian Pacific Islander communities living coexistently with the IDU community. Who would have ever thought that? Just like the black community living coexistently with the gay community. We've learned that disease knows no color, and that we should be working to achieve commonality. And I think that's a great lesson.
Thanks, Jesse. And we'd like us to go now as a panelist, thinking about the fact that we're living in an extraordinary time. Some really amazing research findings in the past few years. The proof of concept of topical chemoprophylaxis followed by oral chemoprophylaxis, new opportunities. Just this past week in Bangkok, Jerome Kim and others establishing what we hope might be correlates of protection with vaccines. So there's a lot of excitement. Roger mentioned the exciting possibilities of thinking about cures and directing the science towards there. Yet, as we know, we're in the middle of an economic meltdown and a very challenging time. So really appreciate if the panelists could think about, Dr. Fauci has the opportunity to talk to presidents, international leaders, secretaries of general of the World Health Organization. From your perspective, what are going forward? What are the opportunities and what are the perils that that your words of wisdom can help inform everybody in the room today, thinking about the way forward for hopefully not the next 30 years of the epidemic, but who knows? Sharon.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to bridge back to something Lynda said a little bit ago, which is that where the AIDS epidemic began to change is when we learned we needed evidence-based medicine. We needed to really have good quality studies to direct what people were doing. And I think if we've learned a lesson in the past 30 years, it's that we need good evidence base for what's recommended and the treatments that we need. And I think we like to think sometimes, or I think sometimes funders and probably our congressional colleagues wish we could just finish it up and get it paid for. Haven't they done enough already? Do we really need more studies? And I think we're at a critical point in the AIDS epidemic. It's not the time to blink. It's not the time to stop. In fact, I think the successes so far suggest that research is exactly what is needed to provide the evidence base to take this to the next level. So I think if I had to say one thing where I think we need to go is to continue to understand we need evidence, not just what we need to use, how we implement it, how we can modify it. And then back to something Roger said in his comments, it's important to dream big. As a woman who definitely has a feminist perspective on the AIDS epidemic and the impact it's had on women, and how oftentimes women are not, I think, a central part of that conversation. And even though we've had tremendous successes in the prevention of mother-to-child transmission, sometimes I feel women are like the infected vectors that we have to protect the baby from. I'd like us, my own personal dream, is to really identify prevention methods that are going to work for women. And certainly we need prevention methods, HIV prevention methods that women can control. I think it's a very big dream. It's a hard dream, but I really congratulate Roger and his colleagues for moving forward with something that would make sense in women's lives, like a contraceptive ring potentially that might have antiretroviral properties that could be used as part of reproductive health strategies by women around the world. I think it's also key as we think about developing evidence that there's not going to be a magic answer. We're not going to have something where it's going to work for everybody, something that makes sense for a 20-something-year-old who's unmarried and having in their party years that Lynda experienced in her 20s are going to be in a very different place than a young black man or someone growing up in Uganda. We can't develop something and expect it's going to work for everyone. And I do think we need evidence for where different modalities are going to make the biggest impact, because people at different places in their lives are going to need different kinds of tools.
Thank you. Jim.
You know, it's hard for a lot of us to remember that this is really a new disease still. And we're the first generation, I guess there's a generation and a half now, but first generation to go through the world with this disease. And that we're really just in the beginning of what could go on for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries without a lot more scientific breakthroughs. It's easy to be, we all live at a point in time, and we're all thinking about what happened today and what's on CNN and what's going to go on in the UN and all this type of thing. But in fact, time will go on, and there'll be more decades. And it's quite easy for us to be skeptical about the world and skeptical about the economy and skeptical about the NIH budget right now. It's good for us to know that people have been very skeptical about science making contributions to AIDS. You know, would the virus be discovered? Would there ever be something like a viral load test? Of course not. There'd never be an antiretroviral drug that would work. Antiviral drugs didn't work worth a damn anyway, almost. There was a couple that worked a little tiny bit. Would there ever be HAART? Would there ever be the 076 trial? Would there ever be a vaccine? Would treatment ever work as prevention? And so I think that the big dreams have to be thought of as innovative science overcoming the skeptics of today. And that because we need a curative therapy and a safe and effective vaccine to really get rid of this epidemic. We need both of those things. And that means we need to continue to have a focus on AIDS. And it is very easy to slip back with a viral infection which is largely silent throughout the world. Still in the world, most people who are infected don't know it. I mean, we know more about how many people are infected in Africa than most of the people who are infected. Most people are still having sex with other people who don't know who have it. Most of the transmission of the world comes from people who don't know they have it to other people who don't know they have it. And that will continue to happen. There'll continue to be huge scarcity and continue to be huge denial on the part of people who think they're at risk. You know, promiscuity is one more partner than I have. That's always the definition. I'm not at risk, it's someone else. He or she looked healthy. You know, so the thing is, denial is always going to be there, scarcity is always going to be there, and this is a horribly stigmatizing, discriminating disease in almost every culture of the world. So it takes the leadership of the people who know about the promise of science to keep a focus on the problem, not just let them say, well, let's just let R01s generally handle this. Let's not have a focused effort on HIV. You know, it's time to move on to something else because the budgets are flattening out. We've spent enough time on AIDS, let's work on malaria. If we don't contain that focus, then the public isn't going to be concerned. Denial, discrimination, and scarcity will start to take over. We'll stop surveillance, and we won't realize that the death rate is rising. So we need the continued advocacy of the scientific community as well as the activist community to keep the focus on AIDS to make those big dreams possible.
Thanks, Jim. Lynda.
I have to repeat collaboration again so we can get the most bang for our buck. But scientifically, I think the cure, at least a functional cure, if we can't eradicate HIV completely at this point. You know, I remember Tony mentioning a cure at a couple of years ago at Croy. And, you know, we're actually working in that direction. So much is happening. It's so exciting. I think that we really need to push for that. And the community is going to have a lobby day in Congress to let them know that, that these things are possible, that people are working on them, that we need continued support for this financially. You know, the budget. Actually, the Senate didn't cut the NIH budget too much for this time around. Now, whatever happens with that eventually is a whole other story. I mean, people like me are going to have to keep coming over here and beating the doors down, which is not a lot of fun, especially nowadays. But we're going to have to keep doing it. We need another champion now that Senator Specter's gone. We need people like Tony who can influence the executive and the legislative branch to keep things going. But, you know, I mean, we really need to stay focused on not being just discouraged. I mean, after so many years, I'm kind of tired, but we have to remember that we can do this, that there's such exciting times. And, really, I think about, we were always, it's the virus, stupid. Well, now it's not, it's the immune system, stupid. That's where we are now. That's where we need the work. And we've made great advances in that. And just think, it's like fountain of youth stuff we're dealing with now. I mean, if we can get the immune system, figure out what's up with this and why it's turned against people with HIV and AIDS, I mean, we could translate that into so many other diseases, cancer and other diseases of immunocompromised people. Just the HIV and aging part. I mean, I don't know why industry hasn't gotten a hold of that. Just think of how many people would buy drugs that would make them be younger. Do you know what I mean? I mean, if you could really get into, I know the government's supposed to do the basic science of that kind of stuff, but when you think about age, when you think about aging, I mean, this is America. Look how much money you could make at that. I mean, I think people are a little short-sighted about that. Well, because you're next to me and you're my friend. But anyway, we just need to keep thinking, keep moving, keep pushing, no matter how tired we feel.
Thanks, Lynda. Roger.
Yeah, since I brought up the dream big, let me now put on my pragmatist hat, which I'm also paid for, and talk about three things. One is economics, two is sociology, and three is science. So economics, we're in a bad economic time, right, around the world, but certainly we're not used to that, at least in science, in my short lifetime in the United States. I would continue to push for the bang for the buck approach, which is we're going to need to pool resources. We're going to need to take the limited amount that we have at the NIH, in academic institutions, and no longer these huge coffers in large pharma. Sorry to disappoint everyone. Everyone's been hit by this. Payer, pressure, and all the things are going to move this along. If we don't stand together, we will, or as Ben Franklin said, if we don't hang together, we will surely hang separately. I think that's very important for this. Whether it's the collaboratories that we're able to put together, public-private partnerships, we have to move that way. No one has enough of the resources or the talent to do it anymore, especially in the next few years. That's economics. Second is sociology. People are people. We have given them in AIDS in a vaccineless, yet vaccineless and non-cured world. We have given people the ability, if they take, the vast majority, if they take a certain group of drugs every day for the rest of their lives, they will vastly extend their life expectancy and their quality of life. But it's very hard to get people to take pills every day for the rest of their lives. We can't get the U.S. population to take a statin or an antihypertensive every day. So we have to realize that people are going to continue to do this until we give them options that allow them to have a more normal life without the burden of pills every day for 30, 40 years. And that's just sociology, that people are people. Certain people have a little more of a disorganized lives, some are more obsessive compulsive, and they will have different parts of the spectrum. So that gets to the next point, which is science. I'm not talking, obviously, and what Jim said, we have to have a cure, we have to have a vaccine, we have to have preventative therapies for especially empowering women across the world. But short of those, pragmatic, right now, we need drugs that not only work, but give people the quality of life that they want. Long-term, whether oral or implants, ways of getting people like we do with biologics, once a month, once every 3 months. Imagine how that changes the world. Because again, I remember when Bill Clinton spoke at Croix, he said part of it, and I agree with this, part of the disease is actually an infrastructure problem. It's not just a virologic and a medical problem. Well, the way you change infrastructure, it's very hard to say you'll build up every African country within the next 5 years. But if you could come up with ways of providing depot antiretrovirals, all of a sudden, what you do in the United States and Western Europe is now at least tractable and possible around the world. I told you I'm putting on my pragmatic hat. And sort of the final thing is give people regimens that allow them to make a mistake. And so you have drugs that give people the ability that if they forget it for a weekend, we don't have to deal with a resistance mutation the next Monday. That you have people that will allow this breathability, if you will, in a regimen. So we've come a long way, but we know, sociology people are people. This is what we're going to have to do to really change the epidemic in at this point, a cureless and a vaccineless world.
Thanks. Jesse.
Well, I think you're seeing why we're all sitting on the same side of the table, because I think the issue of sustainability, both in terms of the larger global context and in terms of the individual context, is a very useful model for us to think about. When I look in my medicine cabinet and think about the 8 pills I have to take a day, and what it's like to be a 55-year-old, well-paid lawyer with Blue Cross Blue Shield, I feel very lucky. But boy, do I wake up in a panic at 3 o'clock in the morning when I realize I forgot something. Mm-hmm. And if I was in South Lusaka, I don't even know if I would know how to panic. And so the sustainability question of making things both easy to take, but also wondering, is the largesse of the United States government going to be here in 20 years with PEPFAR to make sure that I'm taking those drugs? For the people in the United States, I mean, my dear friends at HRSA, look at the problem of the waiting list for ADAP today. There are still half the people in this country who aren't even on care who should be, not to mention the people around the world who could be and should be. So the sustainability of turning that immediate crisis into long-term chronic treatment and chronic support is, I think, the real question for us. Thanks,
Jesse. So we are moving into the lightning round phase of the panel. We've really covered a wonderful wide swath of issues. This panel is really focusing on the science. I'd like to ask our panelists to each, in a minute or two, just give any thoughts that you have that have not been expressed so far, any insights for the way forward. Dr. Hillier.
In 1995, I was invited to the first White House conference on HIV and AIDS, and I remember sitting around the table at that point, and people were so enthusiastic that it would be simple to develop a vaccine, that we hadn't yet really developed the most exciting improvements in healthcare. And I remember someone at the table saying, we have everything we need to stop this epidemic except the will and the money. I think when I think of that, it's 15, 16 years later, there has been a lot of will, and there's been a lot of money, and there have been tremendous improvements. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Fauci's tremendous contributions and his relentless focus on the HIV epidemic. And for that, I think we're appropriately celebrating his contributions today. But it's important to recognize our work isn't done. We've heard today that we have to build on our successes in a way that will allow us to have better prevention products, better treatment products that can be delivered in a sustainable way to everyone who needs them. We really do need more research that will allow us to answer questions on even the simplest things, such as how is the virus really transmitted in different settings? How long of a window do you have before prevention can work? How can we deliver a vaccine that can be very effective in preventing HIV infections? At the same time, not losing sight that we have to combine prevention with treatment, as Dr. Curran alluded to earlier. I think that's a key lesson all of us share. So science moving forward collaboratively, merging treatment and prevention, and understanding that it will take more will and more money to get there.
Thanks, Sharon. Jim.
I think we aren't in a silent phase, but I think our activist viral load has been declining for the last 10 or 15 years since HAART, and AIDS isn't getting the attention it needs to prevent the young people from becoming infected. Every year in the United States, 4.5 million people have sex for the first time, And since heart, that makes, what, 50 million people who've had sex for the first time without Larry Kramer and all people screaming about AIDS every day. And we're kind of in a complacency phase when it deals with HIV. And that means that people who are not even all that young anymore have grown up in an era where AIDS is kind of taken for granted. And I think that's my biggest concern. And that will translate into perhaps a sleepy phase of science unless we start to realize that we're still talking about something for which we don't have hopes that there's enough resources to deal with the current problem, let alone the future problem. There easily could be another 100 million people infected with HIV in the world in the next 30 years, and we can't come close to dealing with what we have now without additional scientific breakthroughs and without empowering people throughout the country and the world to take power in their own lives and their own sexual behavior.
Thanks, John. Lynda.
Well, I guess I'm kind of thinking about the same sorts of things that I've been saying, collaborations among the institutes, among the HHS agencies, with community, with our industry partners. I mean, if you would have told me that I think it's a good idea for pharmaceutical industry to go to Congress with community activists, I would have laughed in your face, but here we are. And that's what we need. I mean, everybody's talked about that and said it over. We really need to work together. And we can't, again, lose sight of the fact that we can work on this together and get a functional cure for this in maybe 10, 15 years. I mean, that's what we really need. We don't have the money for these antiviral drugs for all of these people forever. It's just impossible. But I can't, I really want to say, and both, we've said it from this end and that end, people of color, women. I mean, we can't forget about the people that need to be treated. We're talking about research, but we can't forget about the people in the trenches who won't be receiving care. I really love the docs that treat patients. So many of my favorite researchers have spent a good part of their time treating patients. It keeps you connected to what's really happening with people. And, we're hard up for money. We work day and night, but we really can't forget the people that need us the most, and the reason that most of us started this, in this endeavor to begin with. So I would urge you to keep your eye on that ball, even when you have a lot of balls in the air, I guess.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure. Two topics. Co-travelers. I think we've talked a lot about HIV as a single virus. We forget, or we haven't talked a little bit about the co-travelers, whether it's the Hepatitis C virus that infects about 20% of people and is a major cause of death in those people, even when we give them, until recently, with some of the new drugs that are coming out. Tuberculosis, which is probably the major proximal cause of death in HIV-infected patients around the world. Industry and our NIH and academic partners need to continue to target these, not only because they're important in their own right, but because they could subvert all our gains with antiretroviral therapy, a Pyrrhic victory if you have undetectable viral load and you die of tuberculosis. The second point is, what is the upside of the AIDS epidemic? It's hard to say, right? I have a feeling about this, though. And that is, look at what happened out of NASA, right? The GPS in your car came out of NASA, good things and some of the other problems. With HIV, we learned about the immune system. When I went to medical school at Hopkins, we didn't even know what the half-life of a T cell was. So every time we develop a drug for rheumatoid arthritis, a biologic for people with psoriasis, something, a lot of that has to do with understanding the immune system that has really come forward dynamically with what we've learned from the AIDS epidemic. It put immunology front and center, and you had these spin-offs, if you will, that were positive for other diseases. The other thing is HCV. There is no doubt in my mind that had we not had the HIV epidemic and learned about protease inhibitors and how to rationally target drugs, we would not be able to bring the new drugs out now for HCV. We've done it faster. We are able to target protein pockets in protease or the catalytic site in polymerase, all of which we learned from the AIDS epidemic. So again, you know, it's hard to do it this way, but I think there are things that you have to not forget about, the co-travelers, and you have to think about the positive spin-offs for other areas of medicine.
Thank you. Jesse.
Well, I'm from Kansas, so the rainbow has a special significance for me, and I like to think about what might be on the other side of that rainbow. And one of the reasons why I think it's so hard for a Jim Curran, Tony Fauci, or John Bartlett, or even Jesse Milan, who have been involved in this for so long to get away from it, is because not just because of the professional rewards, but because of the great personal rewards that we've had as well. Because the relationship of all of us working together, the forging of scientists with advocacy, men and women, people of all colors and backgrounds. I hope I'm not speaking for you, but I know that I've experienced it myself. It's remarkable. And the ideal of health and wholeness for all of us seems to be on the other side of that rainbow, and I think we still have a long way to go. And when it's over, when this epidemic is over, that's what we will find.
Thanks, Jesse. And you know, the panel has really done a wonderful job of really discussing the diverse issues we have to confront in dealing with the epidemic. That this epidemic has been a catalytic event, has really transformed a lot of different disciplines, everything from social behavioral science, public health, clinical medicine, molecular virology, immunology, and that we need a combined approach, we need continued advocacy, and I certainly think that we all owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Fauci, and a lot of the remarks today really speak to the various ways in which his leadership has been manifest over these past few decades. So I'd really like to thank our panel, and we'll transition to the next one. Thank you.